Greetings, viewers. Cuba's fate is extremely dramatic. The liberation of Cuba has begun. Ladies and gentlemen, the island of Cuba is located only about 100 miles from the coast of Florida, right on the vital sea routes connecting the Gulf of Mexico with the Atlantic Ocean, and very close to the gateway leading to the Panama Canal. This crucial geopolitical position once made this place the focal point of one of the most tense confrontations in human history. In 1962, when Soviet nuclear missiles capable of destroying most of the eastern United States within minutes suddenly appeared in Cuba, when American spy planes captured images of launch pads being built just 93 miles from Florida, the world went through 13 terrifying days and nights on the brink of a full-scale nuclear war. At that time, in response, President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade and pushed back this threat at the last minute. Those weapons of mass destruction were forced to withdraw, return to where they came from, because Cuba itself never possessed or had its own nuclear weapons. Geopolitical history seems to be repeating itself in a completely new, more subtle, and much more frightening way. At the beginning of 2025, a stern warning was issued by Admiral V.N. Alvin Hosea before the U.S. Congress about an invisible force quietly mapping the most sensitive sites of this superpower. Because the top U.S. military commander revealed a shocking truth. The enemy's spy base is only 90 miles away from U.S. territory. For geopolitical analysts, the name behind this velvet curtain is not too hard to guess. It's an island that is playing the role of a proxy pawn in the global game. Going back to the timeline years ago, there were vague reports about an electronic eavesdropping facility planned to be set up in a country that used to be the nuclear outpost of the Caribbean. But at that time, people didn't think it would be worth billions of dollars. It was that enormous amount of money that exposed a profound economic paradox. Cuba absolutely did not have the financial resources to purchase such expensive equipment on its own, especially when its economy was in critical condition. In a place where food, fuel, and medicine had become luxuries, the idea that a struggling nation like that could possess a weapon system worth billions of dollars was unimaginable, unless there was a powerful backer funding it. As I delved into the layers of secret documents, every tough move the U.S. made against Cuba suddenly made perfect sense. The reason this island was seen as being tied to a nuclear power stemmed from its past communist alliance. Rumors about Chinese intelligence activities in Cuba have actually been circulating since the 1990s. But for a long time, Washington was complacent about Cuba and did not properly assess the seriousness of the issue. The real turning point only happened in mid-2023, when a shocking investigative report officially brought this truth to public attention. At that time, the Wall Street Journal published an exclusive article asserting that Beijing and Havana had secretly reached a strategic agreement. Accordingly, China was allowed to build a large-scale electronic eavesdropping complex on the island in exchange for billions of dollars in financial aid to a government that was desperately short of money. The ultimate goal of this facility was nothing other than to closely monitor the entire communication system throughout the southeastern United States. At first, both governments vehemently denied this information, but just a few days later, U.S. officials quietly admitted a shocking truth. In reality, China had been operating and continuously upgrading intelligence facilities in Cuba since at least 2019. This modernization effort was not an isolated action, but part of a much larger global strategy by Beijing, aiming to establish a global listening post network specifically targeting one objective: the military and security signals of the United States. By 2024 and 2025, researchers from the Center for Strategic and International Studies used commercial satellite imagery to identify 4 specific intelligence sites deep inside Cuba. What appears on the satellite images is not metaphorical at all, but extremely direct and clear. The vast antenna fields, closed circular arrays, and continuously expanding and upgraded space tracking systems have been continuously expanded and upgraded in recent years. Military analysts understand that they are facing intelligence operations directly backed by Beijing. Strategic locations have been identified in Calabasa, El Salao, Guadal, and most alarmingly, Bazuco. In addition, several bases are also positioned in eastern Cuba, providing a direct line of sight toward the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo, allowing China to monitor one of Washington's most sensitive military facilities in the region. In particular, the Guantanamo base is designed for a highly specialized purpose, which experts describe as an intelligence pipeline that gathers data at a density unmatched anywhere else on Earth. It focuses on intercepting satellite information, capturing military signals, and collecting measurement data from space launches at Cape Canaveral in Florida. Of the locations listed, Pasuco is especially significant and dangerous historically and militarily, being less than 10 miles from the legendary Soviet Cold War-era Lurs Signals Intelligence Station. Satellite images from April 2022 show that a new superstructure is being urgently constructed here. It is a perfectly closed circular directional antenna array with a diameter stretching up to about 175 meters, equivalent to the size of a football field, easily dedicated to a single detection system. This is not a weapon that launches missiles, fires shells, or shoots regular bullets, nor is it related to nuclear warheads, but it holds the ultimate power that can determine the outcome of an entire war. This antenna array technology was specially designed for high-frequency direction finding, allowing operators to accurately determine the origin of radio signals from distances of up to 8,000 nautical miles. From Cuba, this coverage spans the entire continental United States, large parts of the Atlantic Ocean, and deep into the Pacific. Relying on this technological network, Beijing can easily monitor U.S. naval exercises, track the routes of both military and commercial ships moving through the Caribbean Sea, and collect radar signature data and telemetry from U.S. missile tests. And most alarming is the ability to detect burst communication signals emitted by U.S. nuclear submarines. Remember, these advanced weapons survive and maintain their deterrent power thanks to absolute silence and the ability to remain invisible beneath the ocean. If China can hear them all the way from Cuba, the entire strategic equation in any potential conflict would be completely overturned. Even if the contents of the encrypted messages have been heavily obfuscated, analyzing the flow of data still provides enormous intelligence value. Who is communicating with whom? How frequently, at what times, and with what volume? Just analyzing these behavioral patterns alone provides an overall picture of the enemy military's combat readiness and tactical preparations. The current threat is exactly why Admiral Alvin Holsey emphasized before Congress that dealing with an intelligence network just 68 miles from U.S. territory has become one of the Pentagon's top priorities in this new era of confrontation. The special alliance between Beijing and Havana is not a temporary coalition, but a deep historical current that dates back to the 1960s. Cuba is proud to be the first country in the Americas to officially recognize the People's Republic of China, laying the foundation for unconditional friendship. Cuba has become a solid political shield for China on the international stage. From firmly supporting the One China principle at the United Nations, recognizing Beijing's legitimacy over Taiwan, to supporting the 2005 anti-secession law, the Hong Kong national security law, and defending China's position in Xinjiang, Cuban diplomats have never wavered under pressure from the Western Hemisphere. This comprehensive bond is the master key that unlocks an invaluable geostrategic privilege for Beijing. This island possesses an optimal position, a perfect observation post, allowing any foreign power stationed here to monitor and closely observe all U.S. military movements, space activities, and commercial shipping routes at the same time. Even during the Cold War, the Soviet Union quickly recognized this truth, turning Cuba into a sophisticated signals intelligence outpost and later a secret nuclear missile base. Although the 1962 crisis was diffused in time, that painful lesson became deeply embedded in Washington's national security doctrine, proving that Cuba could be turned into a gun pointed straight at the U.S. mainland in the blink of an eye without leaving any early warning signs. Now, what Beijing is deploying here also follows a similar geopolitical logic, but it has been elevated to a digital-era intelligence gathering method. Instead of overt missile launch pads, they are setting up satellite networks and digital infrastructure, quieter, harder to detect, but possessing a much more terrifying power to strangle their opponents. Behind the strategic security calculations lies another fierce battle to shape the future economic order, a battle for control over the new energy supply chain. Currently, China holds an absolute dominant position, controlling about 70% of global electric vehicle production capacity and over 80% of lithium-ion battery output, the core batteries for reasonably priced electric vehicles. It is expected that in the period of 2025 and 2026, Chinese manufacturers will account for 71% of total global investment in battery production, with a massive figure reaching about $130 billion, nearly 7 times the spending of the United States during the same period. However, this manufacturing empire is completely dependent on a stable supply of raw materials, especially high-purity nickel, an irreplaceable component in premium batteries such as nickel-manganese batteries and nickel-aluminum batteries. Although China has become deeply entrenched in Indonesia, which accounts for about 60% of the world's nickel production, putting all eggs in one basket always carries a critical risk in the face of sanctions or geopolitical pressure from the West. That's why Beijing has found a perfect alternative called Cuba. This island holds the fifth largest nickel reserves on the planet, accounting for about 6% of global supply, along with abundant cobalt resources, a rare metal that is becoming the focus of competition in this century. Whoever controls this supply will hold the key to the future of the entire global electric vehicle industry. However, at the beginning of 2026, a new and mysterious chapter opened for the West when Sharett fell into a severe crisis, the Cuban economy collapsed, prolonged fuel shortages persisted, and Havana froze a debt of more than $107 million that it could not pay, causing all operations of Canadian corporations to come to a standstill. As Western capital desperately withdrew, Chinese state-owned enterprises immediately moved in and decisively took over. As of April 2026, industrial settling tanks and modern leaching equipment bore Chinese labels. They were quickly installed at the Comandante Ernesto Che Guevara processing plant. Beijing is using its massive equipment, expertise, and capital to save Cuba's nickel industry from the brink of complete bankruptcy. In return, they strictly control the exclusive supply for their manufacturing plants. As early as 2024, China had already become the top destination for nickel exported from Cuba, with a value of about $53 million. And this number will definitely grow exponentially as China has a second highly robust refining hub. Economic forecasts show that by 2030, more than half of the global demand for new nickel will come from battery production. It requires a massive output of up to 1.5 million tons per year, pushing the total global investment in nickel mining and refining beyond $60 billion. All these dramatic moves are not happening by chance. China's 2025 policy white paper on the Americas region has already outlined a power strategy, comprehensively seizing strategic mineral resources and establishing absolute control over the global supply chain, turning Cuba into an indispensable link in the great gamble of the 21st century. Under the harsh and prolonged embargo imposed by the United States, Cuba has almost no choice but to turn its attention to non-Western partners. That's the strategic loophole that lets Beijing move forward. The absence of Western tech giants like Ericsson or Nokia due to sanctions has pushed Cuba's state-owned telecommunications company, known as ETS-SA, into the arms of Chinese suppliers for more than a decade. By building the entire digital infrastructure from scratch, corporations like Huawei, ZTE, and TP-Link have embedded themselves deep in the island's vital infrastructure on an alarming scale. Huawei and ZTE servers now dominate the core network nodes of ETSA, controlling the flow of traffic and storing all user data. From the fiber optic system running along the island nation to the mobile base stations covering Havana, Santiago, Santa Clara, and even sensitive military areas, all bear the mark of Chinese technology. Even the Analba submarine fiber optic cable, which connects Cuba with Venezuela in the region, is also built from Eastern equipment. This is not simply a commercial story, but a silent strategy to turn China into an irreplaceable foundation in all of Cuba's information and communication activities, giving them supreme power to control and protect the regime. The frightening nature of this network is exposed through Huawei's SS Site network management software. Although it is promoted as a standard technical tool, investigations by Sweden's Curium organization and the Mood Network Intervention Observatory have exposed a dark truth. This tool is being used in Cuba to filter searches, block content according to the government's will, and monitor every move of citizens in cyberspace. This is essentially a miniature version of China, covering everything from undersea cables to the phone in every citizen's hand. The country's internet access rate has reached 70%, but it comes with an invisible price. When a wave of student outrage erupted in June 2025 to protest ETSA's insane hike in mobile data prices, making it accessible only to those with dollars, the authorities immediately used the system established by China to cut off internet access in protest areas. This scenario happened in 2021 and was repeated in March 2026. From a global geopolitical perspective, This comprehensive infiltration was part of a broader strategic framework, codenamed Project 141. This grand initiative by Beijing aims to integrate economic expansion with military and logistical influence worldwide. And Cuba is a perfect link in this chain. By deeply embedding itself in Cuba's nickel mining industry and telecommunications network, China not only establishes a solid backup supply chain structure for its mainland factories, but also safeguards its entire electric vehicle industrial strategy against Western pressure and containment. Cuba is not an economic or military powerhouse, but Beijing is now more willing than ever to openly defend this island because it is one of their last remaining socialist allies. On the occasion of the 65th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two countries, in 2025, the Chinese ambassador in Havana declared that this relationship is currently in its golden age. Cuba regularly votes in favor of China at the United Nations on sensitive issues like Taiwan and Xinjiang. In response, Beijing has not hesitated to condemn the U.S. embargo as illegal and inhumane, turning international forums into platforms to defend Cuba and elevate both countries as standard bearers of the Southern Hemisphere to challenge the hegemony of Washington. However, as we move into 2026, this alliance is facing unprecedented storms. The return of Donald Trump to the White House has triggered a campaign called Comprehensive Pressure, directly targeting the Cuba-China alliance. A new executive order has tightened sanctions to the maximum level, cutting off the oil supply from Venezuela and sending the Cuban economy into free fall. The climax of the tragedy occurred on March 16, 2022, when Cuba's entire power grid completely collapsed due to the harsh fuel blockade imposed by the United States. Officials in Washington have begun to speak about the possibility of a complete collapse of the regime in Havana. Faced with this precarious situation, China chose to become more deeply involved in this gamble to protect its ally. In February 2026, Foreign Minister Wang Yi firmly stated that Beijing is determined to support Cuba in defending its national sovereignty and resisting any external interference. By the end of March, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Martin once again refuted the statements from the U.S., affirming Cuba's inalienable right to development. These are not just empty diplomatic words, but a strong warning message sent to Washington that Cuba is the red line that China will never allow to be crossed. The verbal support was immediately substantiated by concrete and significant actions aimed at neutralizing the sanctions. China urgently provided 60,000 tons of rice, along with an aid package worth $80 million to help save Cuba's crumbling power grid. In terms of trade, China now accounts for more than 20% of the island's total foreign trade, supplying everything from consumer goods and machinery to telecommunications equipment in exchange for Cuba's nickel, bioproducts, and tobacco. In particular, in 2025, Cuban banks officially joined China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS. This is a perfect alternative to the SWIFT network controlled by the West, allowing money to flow freely beyond the reach of any U.S. sanctions, while also paving the way for Chinese businesses to invest in the Marriott Development Zone for oil exploration in the sugar industry. Faced with those dangerous moves, the United States is determined not to stand by and watch. The Pentagon and the U.S. State Department have publicly declared that they are closely monitoring and implementing measures to disrupt China's intelligence operations right in Cuba. Washington is improving its internal information and communication systems and urging telecom equipment providers to replace network devices in the region to counter Eastern technology infiltration. U.S. Navy patrols around the island have also been intensified with a relentless frequency as geopolitical pressure continues to mount. This clash shows the harsh reality of the ultimate power game, with reconnaissance aircraft involved. While U.S. satellites and warships monitor every move of China in the South China Sea day and night, Cuba has granted Beijing a similar privilege. That is the ability to respond equally, to monitor the opponent right at America's doorstep. Analysts call this a two-power espionage game, a fundamental upheaval in the power dynamics between the two entities dominating the world order. Veteran political commentator Gordon Chang has released a provocative essay with a bold title asserting that China is about to lose its military bases in Cuba. With the perspective of a seasoned geopolitical analyst specializing in China, he presents a direct argument that Cuba's devastating economic crisis is turning its dependence on foreign partners into a critical vulnerability. According to Gordon Chang, if the U.S. can choke off maritime supply routes and drive the cost of maintaining intelligence facilities to unsustainable levels, Havana will ultimately be forced to trade these spy bases for sanctions relief and reduced pressure from Washington. Based on recently declassified U.S. intelligence documents, it has been confirmed that China's signals intelligence activities in Cuba have been ongoing since at least 2019. He refuted the argument of some Western experts who claim that Cuba is not a direct threat, stating that Beijing's presence there has completely changed the security landscape of the United States. However, international observers remain extremely cautious about this optimistic scenario, as history has shown that Cuba's leadership has resiliently endured more than 6 decades of harsh blockade and sanctions without wavering in their resolve. As pressure from Washington increases, Havana tends to strengthen its ties with China and Russia rather than bowing to the conditions imposed by the United States. Even if overt spy stations are forced to shut down under political pressure, covert data-sharing agreements between the two countries' intelligence agencies can still quietly continue, preserving their core value to Beijing behind an invisible veil. In the context where about 180 countries around the world have established diplomatic relations with Beijing instead of Taiwan, the United States still deliberately maintains a strategically ambiguous stance by only acknowledging China's claims without officially recognizing them, while continuing to sell weapons and maintain unofficial relations with Taipei. When Washington's patience with the spy fortress right off its southern coast has run out, and China is also determined not to back down, what will Cuba have to do?